Buonasera, è un grande piacere, è un onore, it's an honor for us, avere qui il professor Grimm ad aprire un evento importante sull'Europa, su una problematica Costituzione europea, diciamo fra molte virgolette. Io introduco molto brevemente, perché poi le cose più importanti le dirà Matteo Bozzon e soprattutto il professor Grimm. Tengo a dire due o tre cose. Uno, la prima è che questa è un'occasione che ci porta a rincontrarci anche con persone con cui non mi vedo da tempo o non ci vediamo, insomma, oppure ci siamo visti online, e questo mi fa molto piacere. L'occasione è legata, come amiamo qui all'Istituto, a un contenuto che guida un oggetto rilevante, perché poi si collega anche al tema del federalismo e che è molto sentito dall'Istituto, dalla sua dirigenza. Io faccio sempre la parte di quello diffidente, diciamo, quello che ci crede meno, diciamo, mi tocca questo compito che mi autoassegno perché ci credo. Ma insomma, a parte le battute, diciamo che l'Europa è la questione federale, almeno come questione relativa all'individuazione di forme di cooperazione istituzionale sul piano internazionale che evitino, diciamo, effetti decivilizzanti e distruttivi, è proprio nel DNA dell'Istituto, dei studi filosofici, e sicuramente anche Massimo Marotta, che ora non è qui, ma insomma ho sentito oggi, aderisce con forza, ecco, a questo evento che si iscrive in un progetto più ampio, più complessivo, di riflessione critica sul tema. E qui veniamo all'altro punto molto rilevante, che è qui presente Matteo Bozzon, cioè colui che ha proposto questo progetto, questo evento, ma che è frutto di un progetto culturale, appunto, una cosa articolata che vede tanti relatori, qualcun altro arriverà anche domani. Ci teniamo molto perché questo è un caso per noi paradigmatico di una cosa in cui profondamente crediamo. Dico uso il plurale non perché faccia il Papa, ma perché credo di poter parlare anche per Fiorinda Livigni, che è la nostra segretaria generale. Negli ultimi anni l'Istituto è ripartito, non voglio dire che è rinato, ma insomma certo è ripartito con le sue attività, borse di ricerca, seminari, e la cosa più importante che è accaduta è che tanti giovani sono tornati all'Istituto, ne vedo alcuni, e non sono venuti per stare un anno a fare le loro ricerche, così avendo nella morta gora dell'Università Italiana delle risorse, un po' di risorse, non tante, ma insomma un pochino, quelle possibili. No, venuti qui sono creati dei rapporti, delle relazioni fra di loro, con la struttura dell'Istituto, con i borsisti di formazione, quindi quelli un po' più giovani che seguono dei cicli di seminari anche loro, dei progetti editoriali e anche dei progetti di seminari per il programma dell'anno successivo, degli anni successivi. Non è la prima volta che accade. Ecco, noi questa cosa crediamo molto perché insegna appunto di una presenza non occasionale, sia nel fatto che questo non è un luogo dove contingentemente si incontrano persone così perché in quell'anno hanno bisogno di un supporto e poi in qualche modo si disinteressano gli uni degli altri, o comunque passa, chi se ne importa. No, qua si sono sedimentate delle cose importanti, e credo che anche questo sia accaduto anche nel caso di Matteo, con cui abbiamo avuto tante amabili conversazioni e discussioni, in cui ovviamente lui faceva la parte del federalista e ha difeso le ragioni, le vostre ragioni, però devo dire con grande voglia di mettersi da tutti i punti di vista. Io facevo la parte della sovranità, però insomma penso sia stato stimolante, per me lo è stato sicuramente, e appunto ha generato anche questa idea di chiamare un grande costituzionalista tedesco, che io ho sempre molto amato, perché mi sembra consapevole delle ipoteche del politico e della sovranità, diciamo così. Intorno a questo è stato costruito un convegno, mi pare, molto ricco. E questo mi sembra già, quello che ho detto, abbastanza, soprattutto il secondo punto, e in questo senso ringrazio tutti voi, i relatori, innanzitutto il professor Grimm, che ci onora della sua presenza, e ringrazio Matteo per tutto il suo impegno e la sua passione, e gli do la parola perché è lui che ora presenterà soprattutto, come si conviene, il professor Grimm. Grazie.
Ci provo perlomeno. Innanzitutto buonasera a tutte e a tutti, e io desidero anzitutto ringraziare l'Istituto Italiano per gli Studi Filosofici per aver accolto e sostenuto la proposta di questa e la realizzazione di questa iniziativa, di questa 3 giorni sul tema la Costituzione della democrazia europea, prospettive, aporie, sfide, la cui ideazione risale all'incirca un anno fa. Saluto anche gli altri partecipanti al convegno che sono presenti, convegno che avrà luogo domani e dopodomani, ed è con particolare gioia che saluto l'ospite, il graditissimo ospite che abbiamo il piacere e l'onore di avere con noi questa sera a Napoli, il professor Dieter Grimm, chiamato a inaugurare questa 3 giorni con la sua Lectio magistralis che come annunciato si intitola The Overconstitutionalization of the EU and its Democratic Costs. Provare a dare conto anche solo parte della biografia accademica, scientifica, intellettuale e professionale del professor Grimm richiederebbe lo spazio della Lectio probabilmente, ragione per la quale io mi devo limitare ad alcuni cenni relativi alla sua appunto biografia e a dei riferimenti alle sue pubblicazioni. Dieter Grimm è professore emerito di diritto pubblico presso l'Università Humboldt di Berlino e permanent fellow presso il Wissenschaftskolleg sempre a Berlino. Dal 1979 al 1999 ha svolto la sua attività accademica di professore all'Università di Bielefeld, dove dopo aver conseguito l'abilitazione presso l'Università di Francoforte è succeduto alla cattedra di diritto pubblico a Ernst Wolfgang Böckenförde, e dove è stato impegnato anche nell'ambito del prestigioso Zentrum für interdisziplinäre Forschung, di cui è stato anche direttore. Il passaggio all'Università Humboldt di Berlino nel 2000 coincide con la fine del suo impegno come giudice nel primo senato della Corte Costituzionale Federale Tedesca, il Bundesverfassungsgericht, impegno iniziato nel 1987. Durante il suo mandato alla Corte di Karlsruhe, Dieter Grimm è stato responsabile della tutela del diritto fondamentale della libertà di espressione, della libertà dei media, della libertà di riunione e associazione, ma anche del diritto alla protezione, alla tutela dei dati personali e alla concorrenza, contribuendo a tutta una serie di sentenze di enorme rilevanza per la vita democratica della Bundesrepublik. Vengo così alla produzione scientifica del professor Grimm. Al centro del suo lavoro di ricerca e dei suoi contributi si situa quello che egli stesso ha definito la conquista del costituzionalismo moderno, die Errungenschaft des modernen Constitutionalismus, nel contesto innanzitutto dello Stato nazionale, affrontandolo secondo un approccio di tipo storico, potremmo dire anche storico-concettuale. In tal senso diciamo che centrale nei lavori del professor Grimm è la ricostruzione delle condizioni effettuali di possibilità, della genesi del costituzionalismo, ma anche l'attenzione per i suoi sviluppi e le sue trasformazioni, le sue crisi e anche per le sue prospettive future. Questi aspetti sono tematizzati secondo alcuni specifici punti focali. Uno di questi è rappresentato dalla tematica dei diritti fondamentali, un altro è rappresentato da quello delle trasformazioni della statualità, intendendo con ciò tanto le trasformazioni dei compiti dello Stato quanto le trasformazioni, diciamo, di significato della sovranità. E infine un ultimo aspetto, un ultimo punto focale è rappresentato da quello che, dal ruolo anzi rivestito dalle Corti Costituzionali e dal controllo di legittimità costituzionale. Su questo tema ricordo l'ultima pubblicazione in ordine di tempo, anzi la penultima, perché in realtà presto apparirà un nuovo libro per l'editore Beck. In ogni caso questo è il libro uscito lo scorso anno, intitolato Verfassungsgerichtsbarkeit, in corrispondenza con il 70° anniversario dall'istituzione del Bundesverfassungsgericht. Ma insomma, in relazione a quanto detto vanno citati perlomeno scritti fondamentali come Rechtsstaat der bürgerlichen Gesellschaft del 1987, Die Zukunft der Verfassung in 2 volumi, il primo del 91, un testo comunque prodotto di una grande fortuna editoriale, il secondo invece del 2012. E infine ricordo un ultimo testo tra i molti che potrebbero essere citati, si intitola Verfassung zur Geschichte des Begriffs von der Antike bis zur Gegenwart, che è una edizione, diciamo, ampliata della voce Verfassung presente nei Geschichtliche Grundbegriffe di Otto Brunner, Werner Conze e Rainer Koselleck, curata insieme a Heinz Monhaupt. E lo ricordo perché, se non altro, di questo testo esiste anche un'edizione italiana per Carocci. Purtroppo, insomma, le traduzioni italiane dei testi del professor Grimm non sono numerosissime, molto presto ce ne sarà un'altra, perché uscirà presso la terza il prossimo anno probabilmente, di Souveränität, Herkunft und Zukunft eines Schlüsselbegriffs, tradotto da una borsista dell'istituto, Olimpia Malatesta, per cui lo ricordo con piacere. Al di là di questo vi è un altro tema fondamentale che impegna il professor Grimm da oltre 30 anni come studioso e come giurista e come intellettuale pubblico, mi verrebbe da dire, e che si riconnette direttamente alla Lectio di questa sera, vale a dire il rapporto tra lo Stato costituzionale e il processo di integrazione europea. Il tema dunque dell'impatto trasformativo indotto dai processi epocali come l'europeizzazione, a questa si dovrebbe aggiungere anche la globalizzazione, riprendendo appunto il titolo del secondo volume di Zukunft der Verfassung. A tal proposito non posso non ricordare lo scritto che segna l'entrata in scena nel dibattito europeo del professor Grimm, vale a dire Braucht Europa eine Verfassung, la pubblicazione che ha avuto, tra virgolette, il maggior successo, anche perché ha trovato come autorevole interlocutore e antagonista, aggiungerei, Jürgen Habermas. E testo che, come suggerito dal titolo, indagava la questione se appunto la Costituzione come strumento di legittimazione e di limitazione del potere fosse vincolata in qualche modo all'esistenza di uno Stato o se potesse essere trasferita a unioni di Stati quali, a un'unione di Stati quali l'Unione Europea. E, insomma, in che misura l'Europa potesse essere organizzata, ecco, e pensata secondo il modello di uno Stato nazionale. Ma più di recente, nel 2016 è apparso quest'ultimo testo che faccio vedere, vale a dire Europa ja, aber welches, zur Verfassung der europäischen Demokratie, a cui è ispirato anche il titolo del seminario, del convegno che ci sarà da domani e dell'intera iniziativa, diciamo del complesso dell'iniziativa. Un testo che si interroga non tanto se Europa sì o Europa no, ma si chiede quale Europa, alla luce innanzitutto della crescente sfiducia nei confronti delle istituzioni europee, indagandone anzitutto, diciamo così, quelle che sono le cause meno note. Con questo io, diciamo, ho finito. Lieber Herr Professor Grimm, im Namen des Instituts möchte ich Ihnen noch einmal dafür danken, dass Sie unsere Einladung angenommen haben. Wir sind sehr glücklich und für uns geehrt, dass Sie hier bei uns in Neapel sind, und wir sind aber so erfreut, jetzt mal Ihre Lectio zu hören.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this kind invitation. Thank you for this kind introduction. I would, of course, like to speak in Italian in Naples, but I'm unable to. So it has to be in English. I think English is even nowadays even better than German to speak in Italian. I'm told that some 50 years ago that was different, but everything tends toward the new Latin of our days. Now, regarding the subject matter, I think that there is little doubt that the European Union suffers from a lack of acceptance by its citizens. And this lack of acceptance, of course, endangers the European integration project. It is less known, however, that the democratic deficit of the European Union finds in source in the state of European constitutionalism. How is that possible? How is that possible in the absence of a European constitution? And how is it possible that democracy and constitutionalism, that are usually not regarded as contradictory, are put into an opposition? I will try to answer these two questions in the reverse order. It is certainly true that democracy and constitutionalism are not opposites. They emerge simultaneously. The prototypes came into being as democratic constitutions. Non-democratic constitutions were always regarded as a deficient form of constitutionalism. When peoples fought for constitutions, it was democratic constitutions that they had in mind. Where nations turned from authoritarian or dictatorial regimes to democracy, they started by drafting constitutions. How then can a constitution be a democratic risk? I think I would like to take a brief look into the history of constitutionalism, because this will make it easier for us to give the answer to that question. Modern constitutions were the product of two successful revolutions against traditional rule, one colonial rule in North America, the other absolutist rule in France. And these revolutions differed from the many revolts and upheavals of the past in that they did not content themselves with replacing one ruler by another one. They rather aimed at a different system of rule, which was designed by the revolutionaries before they called individuals to power. The lack of legitimate power after the revolution, together with the principles that guided the battle against the new regimes, pointed toward constitutionalism. The principles were developed long before in natural law theory, and the basic assumptions, I think, were two. Government ought to be first legitimated by the consent of the governed, and secondly, it should be limited by innate rights of the individuals. And in the revolutionary situations, both in North America and in France, these principles became guidelines for political action and thereby transcended philosophical theory. Each of the central elements, democracy on the one hand, fundamental rights on the other, called for regulation. Democratic rule calls for regulation because it is ruled by mandate, and the mandate has to be conferred, and the conditions of the exercise of the mandate have to be determined. And the same is true for the limitation of government. Fundamental rights have to be defined. Sanctions have to be determined in cases of transgression. And government organization has to be developed in a way that liberty is at best guaranteed. These rules had to be binding on government. That's to say, this required their transformation into positive law. Only law detached them from history, from the historical moment of the adoption, and from the persons that formulated them, and only law could make them binding and extend them into the future. So law was the appropriate means to reach the goals of the revolutions. The preconditions for legal norms to fulfill this function was, of course, thank you, this is very kind. Thanks. Great. The precondition was, of course, that these rules took primacy over all government acts, inclusive legislative acts. And the consequence was the well-known distinction between pouvoir constituant and pouvoir constitué, and accordingly a division of law into two parts. One part that is attributed to the people and binds government, constitutional law, and one part that emanates from government and binds the citizens, ordinary law. And the first part, constitutional law, regulates the making of the latter part, ordinary law. And I think this distinction is crucial for constitutionalism, and this will play a role as soon as we reach the European Union and their problems. So in the beginning, democracy and fundamental rights appear together. However, that does not mean that constitutions are necessarily committed to democracy and to fundamental rights. Once constitutionalism, modern constitution were invented, it was possible to use the form of constitutions without subscribing to the contents. Napoleon was the first one to do that. And there are even constitutions where both elements are missing. But then we would not speak of the achievement of constitutionalism. But the document may look like a constitution, but it lacks the elements of the achievement. If one wants to enjoy the benefits of constitutionalism fully, democracy and rights must coexist. But this is not to say that they are always in harmony, and that they can never endanger the constitutional project. Democracy can undermine fundamental rights. Fundamental rights may overwhelm democracy. For Carl Schmitt, the two were even antagonistic, so you could have only one, not both. Hence, the question, is there a tension, which I think is clear, or is this tension a contradiction? In order to answer that question, I would like to point out that democracy has some preconditions in order to work. Of course, there is no democracy without free elections, but elections are only free when the citizens are free, politically free, that's to say form and express opinions, articulate interests, associate. Free media are indispensable. But democracy also requires freedom in the private sphere. And all these freedoms cannot be guaranteed by democracy itself. They depend on the protection by fundamental rights. Now, rights in turn have also preconditions. They do not enforce themselves. They depend on governmental power. Yet governmental power is a threat to individual freedom. How to reconcile the two? I think the reconciliation is democracy because it grounds the political power in the will of the rights bearers. Therefore, in my view, it will be an antagonism only if the two elements are pushed to the extremes. One extreme would be radical democracy, which I understand a strictly majoritarian democracy. A strictly majoritarian democracy recognizes only one fundamental right, namely to participate in the formation of the general will, but the rest is left to majority decisions. The other extreme is rights foundationalism. If rights protection is extremely extensive, there is little room for political decision-making and little room for the democratic process, because everything that is regulated on the constitutional level is no longer open for the democratic process. The Constitution withdraws subject matters from the democratic decision-making. And to the same extent, of course, elections do not matter. In the end, all politics is reduced to implementing the Constitution. The public power shifts from the people and the elected representatives to the courts. Both radical versions develop a self-destructive dynamic. Radical democracy can end up in a popular dictatorship. Rights foundationalism can end up in a political immobility. There may be, and there often is, in many countries, too little constitutionalism. But also the opposite exists. There may be too much constitutionalism. Both deviations disregard the crucial distinction between the rules for political decision-making and the political decisions themselves, each disregarded in its own way. In the first case, the tension between the two is dissolved in favor of politics. The Constitution will fail to fulfill its function, namely guiding and limiting government efficiently. In the second case, the tension is dissolved in the favor of the law, which means that the political process is fettered and the administration and the judiciary marginalize the democratically legitimated and accountable institutions. There is no universal principle to determine what belongs into a constitution or what not. The constituent power is free, but I think that there are some, let's say, recommendations or necessities that follow from the function of Constitution. The function of Constitution is to legitimate and to limit political power, but not to replace political power. The danger does not only come from constitution making, the danger can also come from constitutional interpretation and adjudication. The more ordinary law is regarded as constitutionally mandated, the less politics can change if the circumstances require changing, or if the preferences of the population shift from one election to the other. This needs a counterweight. And the counterweight is the amendment power. And the amendment power, this is what I conclude from that, should not be limited too much. It should not be too difficult, too easy, to amend the Constitution. The example of an almost unamendable Constitution is the United States Constitution, of course, with all the consequences that we can see also in our days. With this in mind, I would now like to turn to the European Union and come to the second question that I announced in the beginning. How can the EU be exposed to this danger if it doesn't have a constitution? And it doesn't have a constitution in the full sense. The legal foundations of the European Union were from the beginning and still are treaties under international law. And up to now, they were never transformed into a constitution. Even the so-called constitutional treaty that failed in the referenda in Italy, not Italy, Italy was very much pro-European at that time at least. No, but in the referenda in France and the Netherlands, would not have changed this. It was called a constitutional treaty and with the constitution in mind, but it would have remained in legal terms an international treaty. But of course, these treaties of the European Union fulfill many functions that within a state are fulfilled by constitutions. The treaties specify the purpose of the European Union, they establish its organs, they determine the powers and the procedure, they regulate the relationship between Union and Member States, and as of the Lisbon Treaty, there's also a Charter of Fundamental Rights. The treaties differ from a constitution in the strict sense because these treaties are not, don't have their source in an act of a European constituent power. That's to say, the European treaties lack what is constitutive for constitutions. Constitutions are an act of self-determination of a society, a political entity, a people, or what you like. This element is lacking. The European Union does not give itself a constitution. Rather, it is given a constitution by the member states. And only they can amend the treaties. They are, as it's often said, the masters of the treaties. But now, in addition to that, in addition to these similarities between the treaties on the functional level, between the treaties and a constitution, there is another very important element that could not be found in the treaties but came by interpretation of the treaties. To be more precise, by two groundbreaking judgments of the European Court of Justice in the very early years of the European Union. The effect of these two judgments, of which everybody in European law knows them, I think everybody in political science knows them, philosophy I don't know exactly, we'll see. What the real effect of these judgments was first noticed by American scholars who observed the European development from a distance. And they said what here happened was a constitutionalization of the treaties, which does not mean, of course, that they all of a sudden became a constitution in the strict sense. This would have required a unanimous act of the member states, but it says that they acquire an important element of constitutions. The first decision dates from 1963. That was the time when the European Court of Justice was for the first time confronted with the relationship between European law and national law. And the traditional answer to this question, what is the relation, would have been clear. Since European law is international law, it binds the member states, but it produces effects for citizens only after having been incorporated into or concretized to national law. And this was also the position that the member states who took part in this process, decisions, the famous Van Gent and Loos, 1963, this was the position of the member states, and it was even the position of the Advocate General of the court, who is the person who makes a suggestion how the court shall decide. The court, in contrast, ruled in this decision that European law applies directly within the member state, to the effect that individuals, mainly economic actors, could derive subjective rights from the treaties. That's to say, this decision transformed objective obligations of the member states into subjective rights of the economic actors in the member states. And these actors, by this transformation, came into a position where they could claim their rights before the national courts without having to wait for the national legislature to fulfill its European obligations. However, this initial decision did not say what happens if there is a conflict between national and European law. The court didn't have to speak about that because the case that it decided came from the Netherlands. And the Netherlands, in its constitution, in Article 94, says that international law takes primacy over national, in general, European law as part of international. I don't know of another European older constitution. There's a few new ones have it that say this. So it wasn't necessary to decide the question, well, what prevails. But the next case came soon, 1 year later, 1964, and here the court said that not only European law applies directly and creates subjective rights of the members, but that it prevails over national law, even over the highest national law, the national constitutions. So these are the two fundamental decisions of which the American observer said what brings in effect is a constitutionalization of the treaties. I think I should mention that the European Court of Justice opened the door to this judgment by a methodological turn. European law by the court was neither understood as part of international law, nor was it understood as dependent on the national order to apply that in the member states, but that it has become rather an autonomous legal order that emancipated itself from the national sources. And this is why the court didn't find it necessary to interpret the international treaties like international law is interpreted, namely with a strict emphasis on the will of the treaties, of the parties that concluded the treaty, and narrowly if it affects the sovereignty of the members, but instead it interprets the treaties like one would interpret constitutional law, namely more or less independent of the will of the founders and oriented by sort of an objectivized purpose. And part of this, the third part of this methodological program was the so-called effet utile, which rounded up direct effect and supremacy. And what it says is that European law has to be interpreted in a way that gives the utmost effect to it, and of course to the same degree is the law of the member states restricted. In hindsight, one can say that these two judgments were of a revolutionary nature. When they were handed down, they remained largely below the threshold of public attention. But they were revolutionary because neither direct effect nor primacy was explicitly mentioned in the treaties. It was rather the result of a purposive interpretation of the treaties. That's to say, by no means without alternative. They were revolutionary also because without them, without these two decisions, the European Union would not have been what it is today, namely an unprecedented political entity somewhere between an international organization and a federal state, but because of the amount of powers of the European Union and because of the density of its organizational structure, it's closer to a federal state than to a traditional international organization. Yet it was revolutionary still for another reason, and I think this is one reason that will occupy us a little more. It radically changed the position of the European Court of Justice itself. By the extensive interpretation of European law, the court enlarged its own powers. By a redefinition of the legal nature of the treaties, the court gained a position that by far exceeds the position of any international court and resembles more a national constitutional court. The judgments of the court participate in the direct effect and the supremacy of European law, and not only regarding the organs, the institutions of the European Union, but also those of the member states. So it is no longer the exclusive power of the member states to adjust their national law to European requirements. The ECJ can do that himself by declaring national law inapplicable if it deems it incompatible with European law. Now, my intent is not to discuss the juridical question, interesting question by all means, whether these judgments were right or wrong in a legal sense. They have been accepted by the member states, although the member states never agreed to elevate them to treaty power. They still are not in the treaties, they are in a protocol. But they have been accepted, and they have been accepted by the national courts, on whose cooperation the European Court of Justice depends. They furnished the majority of cases for that court. Now, only the outer limits of European law in the member states are still a matter of discussion. You may remember the German Constitutional Court's decision in the PSPP program, where the court for the first time made use of its claim that it sets the outer limits for the applicability of European law in Germany. So let's leave the question, was that legally correct interpretation of the treaties or not aside? This is history, and we have been living for more than 50 years with it. What I'm more interested in is, of course, the immediate consequences. And the immediate consequence of this judgment is that the member states were no longer needed to establish the common market. Direct effect and supremacy allowed the European Court of Justice to take the economic integration in its own hands. If the court found that national law impeded the common market, national law was declared inapplicable without the states having a realistic chance to defend their own law. Everything now depended, of course, on how the ECJ would interpret the treaties. In favor of unity or in favor of diversity in Europe, market-friendly or regulation-friendly or liberal or social or what you want. And the ECJ pursued the goal of market integration with considerable zeal, subordinating the economic purposes to other goals. Some German observers say this is a court with an agenda which we normally don't combine with the idea of what a court has to do. That's to say, the powers that were transferred to the European Union are interpreted broadly. The powers that the member states retain are interpreted narrowly. The same is true for proportionality. The court applies the proportionality test in a very strict sense to the member states, in a very loose sense to the European Union. The main beneficiaries of this jurisprudence are the four fundamental freedoms. Four fundamental freedoms are all, of course, economic in nature. And we have detailed description of what happened. I limit myself here to just name 3 examples, but there is more to say about it. The first one is that the court did not only prevent the member states from upholding protectionist means, as is explicitly mandated by the treaties, but the court interpreted the anti-protectionist interest of the treaties in a very extensive way, so that it became an anti-revolutionary provision. That's to say, any national law that in the court's view impedes one of the 4 freedoms, as concretized in the treaties, is a target for a review, and the court declared numerous amounts of national law no longer applicable, regardless of whether these laws had an economic purpose or another purpose. The rule that protectionism is abolished lost all contours by this jurisprudence. Almost every law can be understood to have a limiting effect on economic freedoms. Marriage law can be understood. Educational law can be understood of having a limiting effect on the economic freedoms. A second point under these first point is the European treaties prohibit subsidiaries to national economic actors if they distort the market. The European Court said this does not only apply to private economic actors, but also to public institutions. And this is one of the main motives for the wave of privatization that we have seen in the past. Another example, European directives. Directives are laws that bind the member states concerning their goals, purposes, but the member states are free to apply the means in order to reach these goals. The court construed this in a narrow way. Non-compliance or insufficient compliance of treaties makes them directly binding, if the laws, the statutes allow that. Interpretation doesn't have to follow national law, even if it is national law that is interpreted, but has to be applied in the spirit of European law. And the court even gives binding force to directives before the date where the member states have to implement them has been completed. My last example is the Charter of Fundamental Rights. Article 51 of the Charter says the rights bind the institutions of the European Union, of course, but they bind the member states only when they apply European law. The court says implementing, not implying, not applying, implementing, when they implement European law. But the court says implementation of European law is also the implementation of national law if there is any relationship to national law. And due to the degree of entanglement between national and European law, it's easy, very easy, to find a reason for subjecting national law to European law. You may imagine that this jurisprudence left deep marks on national law and national politics. The member states are no longer able to uphold their standards of protection, consumer protection, for instance. The member states can no longer determine what they want to handle, what they want to leave to the market, that's to say to the private sector, and what they would like to handle themselves, that's to say in the public sector. Their space for national legislation narrows tremendously, and the strong position that the European Court gives the European Charter has the effect that there is a preference for economic freedoms, because they are economic freedoms, and national constitutions usually give priority not to economic freedoms, but to personal freedoms, to freedom of speech, communication, and things like that. The jurisprudence of the European Court is usually regarded as a success story, and a success story it is, a tremendous success story, if you consider what role courts normally play. But the success story is a success story for economic integration. But economy is not the only aspect of European integration. They also have a backside, and there is a legitimacy drawback. That's to say, there is a backside with regard to democracy, which is very often not sufficiently noticed. Due to the jurisprudence of the ECJ, there are now two paths, two ways toward integration instead of one. There's the original way. The European member states create primary law, treaties, and enact European secondary law through the Council. This path, this way, is open to the member states only. Regarding the treaties, they decide unanimously. Regarding secondary law, the Council decides until 1987, also unanimously from that moment on, with majority, and a little bit later with the support of the Parliament. The new way is opened by the treaties, interpretation. It is open to the executive and the judicial powers of the EU. And these two ways differ considerably. On the basis of the first way, powers are transferred by the member states to the EU. That's to say, the way is political and involves the democratically legitimated and accountable governments of the member states, plus the national parliaments, and more recently also the European Parliament. On the basis of the second way, the European Union restricts the competence of member states by a broad interpretation of the treaties. And this way is administrative and adjudicative in nature. The democratically legitimated and controlled governments of the member states, the national parliament, also the European parliaments, have no share in this way. They are excluded from participating. It is called an integration by stealth. However, the non-political mode of decision-making does not deprive the decisions of their political character. very often these are decisions of a tremendous political impact that are taken on this second way. It only shifts the power to decide questions of a high political impact from the political organs to the non-political institutions of the European Union. And to the same extent, the political means to secure democratic legitimacy and accountability fail. In the field of treaty application, the administrative and the adjudicative organs of the EU are uncoupled from the democratic process in the member state and the democratic process in the EU. They enjoy a far-reaching independence. The consequence is a difference between, further consequence I should say, is a difference, another difference between the political and the non-political mode of integration. It is called an asymmetry between negative and positive integration. Negative integration means deregulation on the national level, done by the European Court of Justice. Positive regulation means re-regulation, filling the gaps on the European level, which requires European legislation. As a consequence of the constitutionalization of the treaties, negative integration, that's to say, abolishing national regulation, is a non-political matter, is a stroke of the pen by the European Court of Justice. Positive regulation, that's to say, filling the gaps, requires a political decision, member states' governments, the Commission, the European Parliament, and is much more difficult. More than that, the asymmetry also accounts for the liberalizing effect that the jurisprudence of the European Court of Justice has. I don't mean to say that the European Court pursues an economic liberalism program. No, the Court can only contribute to the establishment of the common market by abolishing national law that it regards as incompatible with the Constitution. But it, as I said, cannot handle itself the re-regulation, and the result is a gap. I mean, the more national law is deregulated, and the less the gaps are filled by European law, the broader is the realm for the economic actor. And this is what I call a structural bias toward liberalization. In this jurisprudence, the European Union altogether is more liberal than almost all member states would like to be, or even may, because of their constitutions, be. One element, one field that pays the cost is, of course, social security. Why is all this a reason for concern? Are the treaties not, as I have said, the masters, the member states, sorry, not the masters of the treaties? Don't they have the possibility to stop the jurisprudence or redirect it if they think that it has nothing to do with their intentions? The answer is no. The answer is their hands are bound, and the reason is constitutionalization. The true dimension of constitutionalizations we will grasp only if we take a closer look to what exactly has been constitutionalized here, what gained the character of a quasi-constitution. If we do that, we differ a tremendous difference between national constitutions and the treaties. The treaties are not confined to provisions of a constitutional nature, as I described, determining the purpose of a political entity, establishing the organs, the procedures, etc., etc. But they are full of what would be in every member state ordinary law. And this is why the treaties are so voluminous. As long as the treaties were just international law, that was no problem. As long as there was neither direct effect nor primacy, it was no problem. As soon as the treaties were constitutionalized, it became a problem. In the EU, the crucial difference between the rules for political decision-making and the political decisions themselves is leveled. That's to say, one of the basic elements, crucial elements of constitutionalism are disregarded in Europe. It's not a reproach to the member states who concluded the treaty because they didn't know that they were writing a constitution. That was told them later. And writing an international treaty for a treaty, it was sensible to do what they did. But they didn't expect the fact of constitutionalization, and this changed everything. So I think we shouldn't stick to what the American observers who said the effect of these two judgments is a constitutionalization said, but we should state that the European Union is not only constitutionalized, but it is over-constitutionalized. This has again two important consequences. Over-constitutionalization severely limits the member states' role as masters of the treaties. This role exists still with regard to formal amendments to the treaties. This can only be done by the member states, but it is undermined on the level of treaty interpretation. The principle of conferral, say the European Union has only those competences that have explicitly given to it, is undermined. There is a creeping power shift from the member states to the European Union. And the second consequence, the lack of differentiation between the constitutional law level and the ordinary law level, combined with the constitutionalization, immunizes the Commission and to a certain extent also the European Court of Justice against any attempts by the democratically legitimized member state to react to jurisprudence of the court by changing the law, which is in every member state a totally normal thing, that if the parliament doesn't like what the courts make out of its law, it can redirect the courts by changing the law. This is impossible in Europe as far as the treaty in its extensive interpretation reaches. Likewise, the administrative, executive, and juridical organs immunize themselves against public pressure. As far as the treaties extend, elections do not matter. Political actors who have to take public opinion into account cannot change anything. The administrative and judicial actors who could change anything don't have to pay attention to public opinion. To be sure, the member states are not without any means to stop this creeping power shift. One possibility was to bring an action of annulment because of transgression of powers to the European Court of Justice. The very union-friendly attitude of the court doesn't make this very attractive. Usually the member states lose in court and usually the European Union wins. The exception is an exception. And the other way is, of course, the amendment treaty, the amendment power. But you know that an amendment to the treaties requires the consent of all 26 member states, which is for the purpose like this, changing a line of jurisprudence almost impossible. So I would say, and there but I approach the end of my talk, I would say that the over-constitutionalization is not only a source of the legitimacy problems, of the democratic problems of the European Union, it's the most neglected of the sources. And I think that the blindness toward the delegitimizing effects of the over-constitutionalization misguide also the search for remedies. If now attempts are made to reform the structure of the European Union, the usual attempt is to strengthen the power of the European Parliament, that's to say, endow the Parliament with the powers that national parliaments usually have, turn the European Commission into a government, a European government, and transform the Council into a second house of the European Parliament. I have my doubts whether pursuing this path will help to solve the democracy problem. The reasons are manifold. One is that the European Parliament's representativity for the European citizenry is much smaller than the representativity of national parliaments that also are not sufficiently representative nowadays, but in Europe it's in an increased manner this way. European elections are not truly Europeanized. We elect according to national election laws. The seats are allocated according to quota that do not reflect the size of the member states. And, which is most important, only national parties compete in the election campaign for the European Parliament, and they compete with national programs. Yet, national political parties do not play any decisive role in the Parliament. I'm not sure whether you are aware how many political parties are currently in the European Parliament. It's over 200. We are already in Germany, we are already getting nervous because we have now 6 or 7 political parties and no longer 4, 200. This functions only because these 200 political parties don't play a role. A role in the parliament play the factions, there are 7, which are composed of like-minded political parties, but still the situation is somewhat odd. Those institutions for which we can vote in the European election don't play a role. Those who play a role cannot be voted for. Not really Europeanize the European elections. The legitimacy change from the people via the intermediate institutions to the European Parliament is interrupted. Secondly, and very important for me, is that the European public sphere and the European public discourse is still very weak compared to the national situation. The societal substructure that is crucial for a vibrant democracy, the embeddedness of Parliament in an ongoing public discourse that closes the gap between citizens and institutions is badly developed or absent on the European Union level. Furthermore, I think one has to say that the power of the European Parliament cannot be enhanced without taking the power away from somewhere else, and the loser of this project would of course be the Council. The Council is the only organ where the member states that are in a democratic, most of them, in a democratically better situation than the European Union themselves is represented. So my fear is that one pursues this plan, namely solve the European problems by strengthening the European Parliament, let's say turn the European Union into a parliamentary democracy, would weaken democracy rather than strengthening it. And of course what you can see is that it would not solve the problem of over-constitutionalization in any way, because everything that is in the treaties and by that same token constitutionalized is withdrawn from politics, and the European Parliament is below the treaties, of course, and not above the treaties. So I think an important step, if one understands that over-constitutionalization has something to do with the democracy problems, an important step would be to start here. And it wouldn't be too easy to find a solution. Everything that is by its nature not constitutional law, but ordinary law, antitrust law, commercial law, etc. Take it out of the treaties, downgrade it to European ordinary law, and open it by this way again to the political process. So to say, the treaty would contain, would have its primacy and its direct effect, but would contain only what we would like and find in constitutions, and all the rest that is ordinary law in member states would also be ordinary law in the European Union, which means that it can be changed by the political institutions. So politics is brought in, democracy is brought in. This is not a reversal, it's not a rollback. It only draws the consequences of the constitutionalization that has happened. Not a single norm of the treaties is sacrificed. They all stay, but on different levels. Neither is the function of the ECJ as the guardian of the treaties undermined. Only the democratic process and the political actors which can be made responsible through elections and in the public discourse get into the play again. Legally speaking, it is very easy. I mean, there might be problems. Which norm exactly is still of a constitutional matter or not yet of a constitutional matter? Of course, that would give discussions. But legally speaking, it's not too difficult. Politically, I have little hope. Sorry to end so pessimistic.
Professore. Direi a questo punto che possiamo aprire il dibattito, c'è la possibilità di intervenire, possibilmente in lingua inglese o in lingua tedesca, altrimenti insomma cerchiamo di tradurre, e ovviamente prego chi vuole prendere parola di avvicinarsi in modo tale che con la registrazione insomma... Cosa? Sì. C'è qualcuno? No.
Inizia tu, vedo Belli e sta
No?
Vieni.
Auf Deutsch.
In tedesco potrei, ma effettivamente, quindi è meglio che traduci.
Ja. Sprechen Sie Italienisch? Matteo hilft.
Weil im Moment die Umfeld.
Grazie.
Sì, io conoscevo il testo, allora una prima cosa e poi la spiegazione della domanda. Conoscevo il testo, mi sembrano interessanti e convincenti le riflessioni sull'eccessiva costituzionalizzazione. E sono rimasto un po' meravigliato della conclusione. Non riesco a capirla molto bene, perché mi pare che lei dica che il potere decisionale per colmare il deficit di democrazia deve passare dall'organo giudiziario, come è nell'eccessiva costituzionalizzazione, ed esecutivo, la commissione è troppo tecnica, agli organi politici. Non capisco cosa vuol dire, perché gli organi politici uno pensa il Parlamento, o il Parlamento e il Consiglio, ma lei critica un Parlamento europeo, giustamente. E allora traduci qua che dopo cerco di argomentare. Adesso spiego la meraviglia. La meraviglia deriva dal fatto che io ho studiato altri saggi del professor Grimm e ricordo in particolare uno particolarmente lucido sulle condizioni della legislazione democratica. dove viene criticato Habermas, e io condivido totalmente la critica che viene fatta ad Habermas. Bene, in questo saggio, mi pare in un modo lucidissimo, si mostra che se è vero che la legittimazione democratica consiste nella rappresentatività del Parlamento e conseguentemente della legge, e quindi il governo come potere meramente esecutivo, nella realtà che noi abbiamo, che è caratterizzata dalla presenza dei partiti, dai processi di globalizzazione e dall'efficacia politica indiretta e irresponsabile dei gruppi di interesse, questa legittimità democratica, se c'è mai stata, nella realtà non c'è. Anzi, si può dire peggio, che produce il suo contrario. Cioè l'idea della parlamentarizzazione, cioè della democrazia parlamentare, produce un'amministrazione e un esecutivo non controllati. E allora non capisco che cosa venga suggerito quando si dice per l'Europa, per superare il deficit, dobbiamo dare maggior peso agli organi politici. Ma poi la domanda di fondo è questa: se è vero quello che ho detto adesso, quello che io credo di aver capito da quel saggio sulla legislazione democratica, non è necessario, inevitabile, inaggirabile, direbbero i francesi, pensare in modo diverso alla legittimazione democratica? Ti è chiaro? A te sì è chiaro. Funktionierte nicht mehr.
Funktioniert nicht mehr. Das existiert so. Also nur, dass der existiert nicht in der Realität tatsächlich. Und wenn es wahr ist, muss man vielleicht nicht eine andere Frage stellen, eine neue Information herausfinden. Das ist
regarding the first part of the question, my starting point is, of course, that because as a consequence of constitutionalization, political questions of a high impact go to the court system, are handled by the judiciary, which also the case in other countries, but the difference is they cannot be taken back to politics. They are handled in an unpolitical mode by courts and by executive institutions. But if the politically legitimized and accountable institutions would say, this is not what we intended, or this is not what expresses the preferences of the people in the last election, they cannot take these things back. That's to say, it is constantly, substance is constantly withdrawn from the political process. And this is, I think, a detriment to democracy, because the room where democratic processes matter is narrowed and narrowed constantly. Now, what I do not say, and this is coming to the second part of the question, what I do not say is that everything works fine in the member states. We wouldn't be able to say that. There are big differences in degree, but in more or less all member states, we have also legitimacy problems, democratic legitimacy problems. But in spite of that, I would uphold that the preconditions for a vibrant democracy are still much better on the state level than they are on the European level. On the European level, in the long run, it might become better, but it's almost structural. The fact that we have also legitimacy problems on the level of the member states, that the representativity of the national parliaments is also less solid as it used to be, is not denied by me. So I totally agree with you when you say we also have to consider whether we still can continue with this way of representation in order to be democratic. And this is one of the most important questions of the present times, I think, but it doesn't minimize the specific problems that the European Union has. And I must say, the really convincing proposal how to solve the legitimacy problems on state level, I have not yet seen. Maybe you have them, and I haven't seen it yet.
C'era prima, credo, la professoressa Di Martino. Dovrebbe venire. Ah, sì. Dovrebbe venire qui, se no.
So thank you very much for your very interesting speech. I have three brief questions. The first one is more conceptual, I would say, because if we may not really say that European treaties are a constitution, I wonder whether we should talk about over-legalization or over-legalization at primary level or primary law instead of over-constitutionalization. The second question, but you already answered in the last part of your speech, is about political feasibility of European elections one day with transnational parties all over Europe, and political feasibility of, for example, de-legalization of monetary policies, fiscal policies. There has been proposals in this sense. For example, Marco Dani has made a proposal, and I think you know about that. And I was wondering whether you think it is feasible or not. And then the last question is about the role of constitutional courts, especially with regard to the European Charter. I think there is a convergent movement of constitutional courts, the Italian one and also the German one. In Italy we say there has been a riaccentramento of the jurisdiction by the court in this sense, and I think the German Bundesverfassungsgericht goes in the same direction with the Recht auf Vergessen decisions, and I was wondering whether is your opinion about that. Thank you. I think it is helpful to distinguish between constitutionalization and legalization. Of course, we have over-legalization in many fields on the national level and the European level. What I see is that most people who complain about Europe see the over-legalization of Europe. They never see the under-legalization that happens because of the asymmetry between positive and negative integration that I mentioned. I think that the difference is important because it is a difference between what can be politically decided and what cannot be politically decided. So I think I need the notion of constitutionalization and over-constitutionalization in order to show how many things have been withdrawn from politics. If I have over-legalization in the field of ordinary law, I would also have enough examples and would criticize that, but then I can blame the politicians, and I can blame them in the next election, or I can blame them in the political discourse. So I think I would keep that in spite of what you said. Feasibility is a big problem. I mentioned it already regarding my proposition, how to solve at least a part of the problem, that I don't see a chance that the remaining 26 member states will agree on that. And I also see something that maybe you alluded to, I'm not totally sure, when you mentioned fiscal policy. Of course, what we see is that some prior decisions of the European Union that were taken without public discourse, public participation, now cause problems that can only be solved by even more Europe. The European Union, the monetary union is the best example. I think the monetary union, which I'm basically fond of, as I'm absolutely fond of European integration. I'm not one of the Eurosceptics, but I see some deficits. I think the European monetary union was established prematurely. And it has its difficulties as long as the economic strength of the member states of the monetary union is so vast apart from each other. And if then a crisis occurs, like the Greek crisis, it can be only solved by even more Europe, and mostly sidelining again the democratic politician making, but it's an incremental politician making. Number three, yes, I see a convergence between the interpretation of fundamental rights on the European level and on the national level, and I think that is what we need. But again, not without any hesitation. My hesitation concerns the fact that I briefly mentioned that the European Union still gives priority to economic rights. And this is what member states cannot tolerate. The European Court of Justice was even willing to balance human dignity. There's nothing above human dignity in Germany. And human dignity is regarded as absolute, with the consequence that it has to be defined narrowly. But the European Court says it can be balanced against economic interests. And dignity will be very strong, and if a state like Germany gives such an impact and weight to dignity, we may say okay, but basically you can balance dignity against an economic interest. And as long as this prevails, I think it is necessary that national constitutional court establish a barrier. With regard to Recht auf Vergessen, a right to be forgotten, the German court also diverged from the European court by saying if it is national law that is not mandated by European law, we apply the German fundamental rights. If it is European law or law that is national law that is mandated, so that the member state doesn't have any discretion, then we apply European court. The European court doesn't like that very much because it says that European law has a much broader applicability than the national courts think, but they are on a way of taking that. And the same is true with regard to the European Court of Human Rights. There I also see a convergence between national jurisprudence and European jurisprudence.
Inviterei il professor Gozzi che voleva intervenire. Le chiedo sempre di avvicinarsi.
So, vor vielen Jahren spreche ich nicht Deutsch, so leider werde ich auf Englisch sprechen. Yeah. Sorry. So, I come back to the very well-known question of the distinction between treatises and the Constitution that you have introduced and very well debated and deeper considered. As you know, because you have written this question, according to the European Court of Justice, the treatises are considered a constitutional document. But you have clarified that there is no questions of a distinction about the functions, because the function, perhaps we could say that they are very similar. Treatises define the power, define the procedures, and so on. But the question, as you correctly, and I agree with you, regards better the question of the subjects that are at the origin of both the treatises and the custom and the Constitution. Indeed, we could say the Constitution are, we could say, autonomous, because they have the power of a people that through the constituent power defines the contents of the Constitution, contrary to the treatises of the court. But despite these differences, you write in your fundamental essay about the fundamental rights and the Constitution that we could say that the treatises represent the form of the Constitution. In which sense? In the sense that they represent the core question of a Constitution, or in which other sense? Thank you. Thank you very much.
May I add a question?
Yeah, sure.
So, if we...
Maybe you have this one.
No, but I need
that
the other
one. Yeah.
So if we go in the direction suggested by your remedy to the overconstitutionalization, that is to level the content of the treaty, so the primary law remains. So what is entailed in the primary law should be separated and must be individuated what the original constitutional core is. And then, isn't this not like a kind of a way to go in the direction of a national constitution for the European Union, which seems to be, and I try to come back to the question of Professor Dudo, so isn't not somehow contradictory with the assumption that the EU is not a state and should not be a state? So the question related to this is, what about the legal nature of the EU, which is not an international institution and it's not like a state, a Bundesstaat, a federal state? Shouldn't be this question at the core of the reflection of the purpose of a new way to think about Europe?
I see regarding content of the treaties, I see in the treaties all these subject matters regulated that also should be regulated or will be regulated in a constitution on the state level. Yeah, everything is there, the purpose is determined, the separation of powers, the institutions are organized, their procedure is prescribed, the limits are prescribed in fundamental rights. So these are all elements that we would find in national constitutions. So the difference cannot be on the level of subject matters. Now, another point is, of course, that not only this is in the European treaties, but also this bulk of ordinary law, of commercial economic law, which in my view does not belong, should not be in a document that has become sort of a constitution. But for the rest, everything that one would expect in a constitution is also in the treaties, so that the fundamental difference from me is, as a matter of fact, the origin. Yeah. It is not an act of self-determination of a society or of a people or of a political entity, how you want to call that. In the member state, we would say of a nation or of a people. This doesn't fit for Europe, so I say as a society or a political entity. So this is missing.
This is missing. And with this, I think I can refer to what you say. What would happen if we add it? What would happen if we add the missing element, namely act of self-determination and not of heterodetermination? Again, legally it would be easy. The 26 member states say, we conclude a last final treaty in which we hand over the constituent power of the European Union, we give it away and hand it over to the European Union itself. And then it's a matter for the internal regulation, how does the EU do that, by referendum or not by referendum, and so on, etc. I don't see at present any perspective that the member states will be willing to do that. Although in the coalition treaty of the new German government, it is said we expect this to happen, but I don't see any realistic chance. But this shouldn't prevent us from discussing what would be the effect. The effect, I think one has to be clear, would be the European Union is by that very fact turned into a state. Yeah. If self-determination is added, then the things are turned around. No longer decide the member states which powers they give to the European Union, but the European Union decides which powers they take from the member states. There is no longer the principle of individual empowerment, there is no longer competence, but this is all turned around. So if one asks for adding the missing element to the European, I say, quasi-constitution, but the name is not important for me. I don't stick to the name. If we say we want to have it as a full constitution in the strict sense of the achievement, as I like to say, nilly-willy you establish a European state. So it must be very clear whether one wants that or does not want it. I don't want it because I don't see that democratic problems will be easier to be solved in the European state than in by the member states. So I don't think, and I think that I understand the European Union as a tremendous innovation in political institutions of a high necessity, and it will be attractive for more parts of the world, but just not being a state. I think this has to be made clear because many people who ask for a constitution in the true sense don't know what the consequences are. The consequences are a state. And then one can discuss, of course, do we want a state or not? But it has to be on the table if this question comes up.
Thank you very much for your lecture. Very interesting. And there are two questions. The first, the integration of markets in 1950, 1960 was in part a technical, economical fact. Because there was an economy, a national economy encapsulated in state, democratic state. But after the Treaty of Maastricht, maybe after the Act of 1986, maybe someone say so. It is we have the money, the euro. The money is politics, no a technical fact. But the way to privatization too is a political way, an indirect political way. The building of euro, sure, is a ordoliberal, a specific view. Philosophical, political view, maybe economic and social view. So the money presupposes a form, a sort of a political union and a form of solidarity, social solidarity. The second question, The overconstitutionalization is a way to answer to a deficit of politics and democracy with the money, the euro, the ordoliberal form of organization of society in Europe, with the Angloria 30, maybe, or was maybe, or now is a Holzbeck. Mm-hmm. I don't know, but I have this doubt. So, how many constitutionalism, political constitutionalism, in your view, are, how many forms of political constitutionalism are now in over-constitutionalism of Europe? I don't know. Over-constitutionalism is a politics or another way of politics, an indirect politics that maybe is problematic for democracy, but maybe for the form to manage order, to balance an order, a pluralistic order.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
I pick up what you first said. It's interesting that as long as the European integration looked only like a more technical thing, economic thing, it was widely accepted. And it brought progress for most people, not for everybody, but most people are better off after the European integration than they were before European integration. Especially there are some countries that were regarding wealth and development at the end, like Ireland and Portugal also, others one could mention, and they are better off. So as long as this was the only purpose, there was a lot of acceptance. In the moment when it turned more political, is to say when it affected the everyday life of people, not in the positive, not only in the positive sense, but also in a negative sense, or in a sense that they were not so fond of this change. And I think you rightly point to Maastricht. I think Maastricht is the turning point. All of a sudden it became clear by the Maastricht Treaty. Maastricht Treaty wanted to create a closer, ever closer union of the people, and all of a sudden it was clear to what extent it had already been developed, but clandestine. With soft steps, unnoticed by the public, unnoticed by many politicians themselves, unnoticed by the media, and the legal science was a special case. The people who specialized on European law were ardent followers of European integration, which is fine, but it's not a scientific standpoint, and had, so to say, a clandestine agreement, never criticize anything. So that the European integration also developed without the criticism of those people whose profession it is to look critical on developments. And so Maastricht was in a way a shock how much progress in other fields than just market fields had been made, and how much of decision-making power has already been gone from the member states to the European Union. And then, of course, comes as a second step, and how democratically legitimized is it there? And the answer was apparently less than even in a non-well-functioning democratic member state. So I think this is the problem. And I would not say, if I understood you correctly, that over-constitutionalization is an answer to that. Because over-constitutionalization is the consequence of the fact that the member states in 1957 in Rome wanted to conclude an international treaty, and their duties of the states had to be regulated as
exactly as possible. But then they were told 7 years later, oh no treaty, you made a constitution. And then they had all this stuff that is not constitution-like in it. And the constitutionalization is 1963-64. There we were not so much aware of the problems. Yeah? We were aware of the problems when they had long been decided. What for me is the biggest problem is that it is so difficult because of over-constitution to repoliticize. I think it is absolutely necessary to repoliticize. There was support among the population for the European Union as long as it looked unpolitical, and it changed to a large extent when it became open that it was a political endeavor and that the citizens were never asked. And the only cases where they were asked, namely in the referendum on the constitutional treaty, those countries where they were asked, they said no.
But it's difficult to repoliticize with the 27, 28 countries. With 50 maybe.
Clear.
Ci sono altre domande?
Thank you, Professor Grimm. Just one question. Do you think that constitutional courts can play a role in putting an end to this process you described, the over-constitutional? Okay.
I have also problems with the word.
Or you think that the problem is too big to be treated by an institution formally judicial, and problem to be treated by a political process directly.
In a limited way, I think the national constitutional courts can contribute, but in a very limited way. What can they do? They can prevent that too much political substance emigrates, so to say, from the state level to the European level. And this is, I think this explains the whole jurisprudence of the German Constitutional Court. The German Constitutional Court is aware that the preconditions on the national level for democratic government are better than on the European level. Again, agreed that they are not wonderful and glorious on the national level either, but the preconditions are better. And so one of the constant attempts, if you go through the jurisprudence of the German Constitutional Court in matters European, is don't empty the national institutions of political substance. And this is a limit to further integration as well as interpretation is concerned, as treaty amendment is concerned. By the way, I should have mentioned to your question that the Constitutional Court in the Lisbon judgment said that Germany is by its own constitution barred from participating in a transformation of the EU into a state. This can only be done by the German people themselves. This doesn't mean by a referendum, because the constitution doesn't provide for referendums, but by a new constitution. So if there are attempts to transform the European Union into a state, and Germany wants that, the basic law has to be put into the wastebasket. A new constitution has to be made which either says directly Germany takes part in European statehood, or German authorities are authorized to take that step. So, but this is a high barrier, and most people have forgotten this passage from the judgment on the Lisbon Treaty. But this also, of course, would be a position for the German Constitutional Court to say, no, this step is not possible. And then it depends on whether politicians would find support in the German population about making a new constitution. And you know that the basic law is very much venerated as a constitution in Germany, more than constitutions in many other member states. So I think this is the limited role. And the limited role is, of course, also when the jurisprudence on fundamental rights take a turn that is, let's just say, goes away from the basic understanding what we have liberal constitutional rights for on the national level. And then the court says decisions will not be applicable in Germany. But these are all minor redrawing the limits, yeah, but for the basic thing I think it's not a matter of courts.
Questioni? Prego.
Dear Professor, only a question. Your kind of positive integration for Europe is like Ruo's band integration in his theory.
I never thought of that. I never thought of it. I mean, for Rudolf Sment, integration is the notion with which he explains the whole constitutional order, and he is even willing to sacrifice the legal binding force of constitutional law in the service of integration in this place of the state. When I speak of European integration, I never thought that I'm proceeding on the ways of Rudolf Sment, but I just see with integration on the European matter which quantity of political questions is decided on European level and which quantity is decided on state level. So this is more a quantitative aspect. Which substance better is communalized, so to say, and which remains national. Whether way back there is meant, I have to think that over. I didn't think so, but it never occurred to me, so I'll think that over.
Prego.
Thank you, Professor Grimm, for your lecture. It was very interesting. And my question is this. For you, is it possible a constitution without constituent power? So a constitution constructed by legal process and not political process. If we look at the constitutionalism, at the process of constitutionalization, we can see that before the constitutionalization there is political energy. If we see at the contemporary constitutions, before the constitutions, there was a big war. Before the constitutionalization in 1789, there was a revolutionary period. So the construction of the Europe Constitution by a legal process, it's really possible. It can be possible, or
what you describe is certainly true. No constitution comes out of the blue. and there is always a constitution before the constitution. And certain things even have been decided without a real decision having been taken. So after 1945, after the end of World War II, there was no way for Germany to establish an authoritarian state. Yeah? Nobody had taken the decision, but it was clear that was just out of the possibilities. It had to be democracy, but which type of democracy? There are a lot of decisions could be taken. Now, and we see that in the 19th century, almost all European states, Italy included, Germany certainly included, were constitutions without a constituent power of the people. The constituent power were the monarchs, the princes. Nevertheless, we speak of constitutions, and this is why I so often tried to make a difference between constitution in the strict sense or constitution as the achievement. The document, if you want to have all the benefits of constitutionalism, you need it in the full sense. It is easy for me to agree that you can have a document and name it constitution without all the elements. This is possible, but even the name, it's not so important for me whether we call the treaties a constitution, like the European Court of Justice did in certain decisions. But what is important for me is that one, that one knows what one wants to say with the name. And when I hear so much talk about constitutionalization, not only in Europe, but on world level, the Charter of the United Nations is called by some public international lawyers the Constitution of the World. The Statute of the World Trade Organization is called the Constitution of the WTO, and so on. Then I see that this, so to say, unclarifies the differences. And what for me is important is the difference. And important is whether, for the benefits of a constitution, whether it was, as a matter of fact, an act either of the people or attributed to the people. Doesn't have to be not necessarily a referendum, but attributed to the people as the source of all public authority. And if this is not the case, we can name the document as we want, but we have to see it doesn't bring everything that a constitution in the true sense brings. Yeah.
We have God or the people.
C'è qualcun altro che desidera intervenire? Come al solito parlo senza il microfono. Direi chiudiamo. Sì. E a questo punto allora chiudiamo. Io ricordo che domani in realtà inizia alle ore 9 il convegno, appunto, che menzionavo nell'introduzione. Alle 10? Alle 10? No, alle 10. Alle 10, no, è giusto. È giusto. No, era l'idea originale. No, è alle 10, scusate per la... alle ore 10. A mezzogiorno. E niente, per cui a domani a questo punto, e grazie a tutti. Grazie a tutti.